The first American dream was built on ashes. We know the story of America's founding. The Pilgrims, the Mayflower, the first Thanksgiving. We celebrate the city upon a hill. John Winthrop's vision of a righteous, God-fearing colony that would be a light to the world. But there is another story. A story that doesn't appear in your high school textbook. A story about what happened before the American Revolution, before the Constitution, before the Declaration of Independence. This is the story of how the first American dream was built, not on freedom, but on fire. And the men who built it? We still call them our founding fathers. Let's go back to the beginning. In the early 1600s, the most powerful nation in New England wasn't English. It was Pequot. The Pequot people had dominated the region for decades, through diplomacy, coercion, intermarriage, and warfare. By 1635, they had established a confederacy over the entire Connecticut Valley and eastern Long Island. Their population was estimated at around 2,200. They controlled the fur and wampum trade, the currency of the region. They were farmers, hunters, fishers. They had a complex society, a functioning economy, and a powerful military. They were, by any definition, a sovereign nation. Then came the Dutch. Then came the English. The English settlers didn't arrive as friends. They arrived as competitors. And they quickly realized that to control the land, they would have to break the Pequot. John Winthrop, the first governor of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, had a convenient theology. He argued that God had consumed the natives with a great plague in those parts, and that this gave Puritan settlers a divine warrant to settle in New England. In other words, God had cleared the land for them. The natives were dying off anyway. So why not speed up the process? By 1636, tensions had reached a breaking point. A Boston trader was murdered, presumably by a Pequot, on Block Island. Massachusetts authorities sent a punitive expedition that burned native villages and destroyed crops. The Pequot responded. They raided English settlements. On April 23, 1637, with Pequot help, the Wongunk chief Sequin attacked Wethersfield. The first time women and children were killed during the war. This was the excuse the English needed. On May 1st, 1637, the Connecticut colony declared war on the Pequot. What happened next is one of the most brutal chapters in American history, and it was led by a man named Captain John Mason. On the night of May 26, 1637, Mason led a force of English colonists, along with Mohegan and Narragansett warriors, toward the main fortified Pequot village near what is now Mystic, Connecticut. The Pequot were taken by surprise, but they mounted a fierce defense. Mason quickly realized he couldn't defeat them in close quarters combat inside the palisade. So he made a decision. He ordered the wigwams set on fire. Within an hour, more than 400 Pequot men, women, and children were burned alive or slaughtered as they tried to escape. Some estimates placed the death toll as high as 700, including mostly women and children. This wasn't a battle. It was a massacre, a deliberate act of annihilation. Listen to how Mason described it in his own account, written years later, without shame. He wrote, "But God was above them, who laughed his enemies and the enemies of his people to scorn, making them as a fiery oven. He called mass murder the work of God." The Mystic Massacre practically broke the Pequot. Those who survived fled. They were hunted down, captured, and sold into slavery. The tribe was virtually eliminated as a political entity. The Pequot War was the first sustained conflict between Native Americans and Europeans in northeastern North America. And it set a precedent, a template for how the English would deal with anyone who stood in their way. The pattern didn't stop with the Pequot. 40 years later, it happened again. This time, it was the Wampanoag, led by a chief the English called King Philip. His real name was Metacom. His father, Massasoit, had greeted the Pilgrims at Plymouth in 1621. He had welcomed them. He had helped them survive their first winter. And what did his people get in return? 55 years of encroachment, land disputes, cattle trampling their corn, cultural erasure. The war began in 1675. After Plymouth Colony executed 3 of Metacom's warriors for murdering a praying Indian who had converted to Puritanism and was suspected of spying for the colonists. Over the next year, Both sides raided villages. Hundreds were killed. 12 out of 90 New England towns were destroyed. It was, by some measures, the bloodiest conflict per capita in American history. And the outcome was the same. The native population was decimated. The survivors, including Metacom's wife and son, were sold into slavery in the West Indies. The pattern was clear. First, provoke a conflict. Then, use that conflict as justification for total annihilation. Then, take the land. Now, here's where it gets uncomfortable. Because the men we revere as the architects of American liberty were the inheritors of this legacy, and they continued it. Thomas Jefferson, who wrote that all men are created equal, proposed the creation of a buffer zone to push eastern Indians west of the Mississippi, clearing the land for American expansion. He believed native people could adopt white culture, but he also used treaties to pressure them off their land, piece by piece. Then came Andrew Jackson. In his 1829 inaugural address, Jackson set a policy to relocate all eastern Indians. In 1830, Congress passed the Indian Removal Act, which authorized the president to negotiate treaties for land cessions and removal to Western territories. Between 1830 and 1850, about 100,000 American Indians living between Michigan, Louisiana, and Florida were forced to move west. The Cherokee fought back. They took their case all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court, and they won. Chief Justice John Marshall ruled in their favor. And what did President Jackson do when he heard the ruling? He reportedly said, "John Marshall has made his decision. Let him enforce it now if he can." He ignored the Supreme Court. He ignored the law. And he ordered the removal anyway. In May 1838, federal troops and state militias began rounding up the Cherokee. Families were separated. The elderly and ill were forced out at gunpoint. People were given only moments to collect their belongings. White looters followed, ransacking their homesteads. An estimated 15,000 people died of exposure and disease on the journey that became known as the Trail of Tears. To understand the full scale of what happened, we have to look at the numbers. Scholars disagree on exactly how many native people lived in North America before Columbus. But there is broad agreement on one thing. Within a century of European contact, the indigenous population was reduced by 90% or more. Disease played a massive role, but so did genocide, warfare, export slavery, and environmental destruction. The men who built this nation. Winthrop, Mason, Jefferson, Jackson. They weren't just men of their time. They were architects of a system that systematically erased entire civilizations. Today, the Pequot are still here. They rebuilt. They survived. But the story of how they were nearly erased, that story is part of America's foundation. And until we tell it honestly, we haven't really told the story of America at all. This isn't about guilt. It's about truth. Because you can't understand where you're going until you understand where you've been.